Today's subject is an introduction to immunology. The word introduction has been put deliberately, although even otherwise I'm fond of introductions, because this is such a vast and complex subject that one can give only an introduction, not only because time is limited, because even my knowledge is limited. This is such a vast subject that I may tell you about half of what I know, but what I know is not even 1% of what a top immunologist would know. And what the top immunologist knows may be only a small fraction of everything that is known in the field of immunology. And everything that is known in the field of immunology is in itself only a small fraction of everything that can be known or what still remains to be known. And therefore, all I can do is give you a mere simple introduction to the field of immunology. And this is something in which we all got interested, particularly during the corona pandemic, because the antibodies and the vaccines and so on were being talked about so much in the media that we all got curious to know a little more about this complex subject. And although the pandemic is now over, it has been declared to be over officially. We still can benefit a lot because the pandemic might be over, but life on Earth continues to be as it has always been. Life on Earth is, in fact, part of a rather complex, delicately balanced ecosystem, and we are a part of it. And it is based on a give and take, and the overall economy of this give and take is rather harsh. As you know, in a little slightly different context, as Sri Aurobindo says somewhere, that give and take, for which we can use the word sacrifice, is something that is fundamental to the world or the fundamental to the play of nature in general. And if we refuse to give, if we only want to take, the sacrifice will be extracted by force. We'll be forced to give. So it is in this harsh economy that we live. One form of life thrives on another form of life. There is coexistence. It is by and large peaceful, but all the same, what is important is that we should have some defense mechanisms which can help us, at least to a limited extent, in surviving in an environment in which other forms of life are also wanting to live like us, and some of them may end up living at our expense. So this is sort of a by way of introduction, but all the same, life on Earth has been around for billions of years, human beings also for a very long time. And the enemies that human beings have to dread are not really the snakes and the tigers, but tiny organisms which we can't even see. And the fact is that in spite of these organisms, we have survived and they have also survived. Not only they have survived, as we saw, new ones keep emerging like the coronavirus did recently. So in this sort of system, which is based on coexistence, the germs have survived, we have survived, and the tiny germs, in spite of their microscopic size, are in no way less likely to survive than us. In fact, they might continue to be there even after human beings have become extinct. So with this little introduction, let's go to the PowerPoint. So this is a mere introduction to this vast subject of immunology. Before I go further, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you, once again from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. We are like a hotel. Why I'm saying so is because the number of human cells in the body is about 30 trillion. The number of bacterial cells, about 38 trillion. Both these estimates have been changing with time. Different estimates vary a lot one from the other. But one thing that is common to all the estimates of this type is that the number of bacterial cells is more than the number of human cells. And I put bacterial in quotes because Strictly speaking, these are not all bacteria. Some of them may be fungi and viruses and so on. But the fact is that these tiny germs, they are much more in number than the human cells. So in fact, we are more germs than human, and we host all of them. And so we are serving as a sort of hotel for this vast population of these tiny microscopic organisms. However, not all these guests are welcome. In India, we say Atithi Devo Bhava. All guests are to be treated like God, and a guest is like a God. But the fact is that uh, in this situation, at least, many of these uh, guests, so-called guests who are living in this hotel that our body is, are not really guests but infiltrators. They can do harm to us, and therefore, what is important is that we try and prevent these infiltrators from entering. And if they have entered, we should have a way of defending ourselves before they can do us much harm. And in this conflict between the guests who are always welcome, and in fact, by and large, much of this bacterial population or population of microorganisms is helpful to us. They help us in many ways. And in fact, this idea of having a microbiome, particularly, these bacteria reside on the skin and in the gastrointestinal tract. And this is what is now called the microbiome. And the type of microbiome that we have seems to be an important determinant of health, which means that these guests are in fact contributing to our health in many ways. And therefore, this ancient idea in Ayurveda that as is our gut, that is the gastrointestinal tract, the digestive system, so is our health, has more than a grain of truth about it. But anyway, that we shall have an occasion to talk in greater detail after a few days. But the important thing is that these welcome guests, who are by and large the much larger in number than the infiltrators, also help us in taking care of the infiltrators. And they do that by sometimes actually attacking the infiltrators, but more often by competing with them for nutrients which are available in the gastrointestinal tract. And therefore, one way of increasing the number of desirable bacteria in the gut and preventing the infiltrators is to increase the number of these desirable ones so that they'll provide good competition for the limited amount of food that is available in the gastrointestinal tract. And therefore, suppose a person has taken antibiotics and has killed a vast population of germs in the gastrointestinal tract, and the person gets a diarrhea. But then to take care of this diarrhea, what we do is to give the person uh, germs which are healthy through the mouth, like lactobacilli, sometimes as such in a capsule or in the form of something from curd. I was hesitating to talk a little bit about curd, although uh, by and large, most people think that it will be very good to take curd all the time, and particularly in a situation where the gastrointestinal tract is upset and we want to replace the uh, unhealthy germs. We want to increase the population of the healthy germs, and the curd will be a good way to do it. Yes, the curd does have a large population of germs which are good for us, but all the same, in Ayurveda, it is discouraged. Curd is discouraged because it can block various channels. Uh, and what is favored is chach, that is buttermilk, which means churn it, remove the butter from it, and then what is left behind is the chach. That also has the same type of germs, and this is what would be favored in Ayurveda. But all the same, the principle remains that uh, if due to any reason, taking antibiotics or due to any other reason, the gut flora have been disturbed, and we are left with only a small population of the friendly germs, who can be called our welcome guests, and that leaves an opportunity for the infiltrators to come in, making use of this opportunity that there is food available, but we have very little competition. So to prevent that, we make concerted efforts to increase the number of these desirable germs, no matter how we do it, by taking a capsule containing lactobacilli or whether we do it with buttermilk. In fact, this is something which Mechnikov, one of the pioneers in this field, uh, had realized. And under the impression that these germs will do him good, he started taking very large amounts of buttermilk every day. in fact, heroic amounts. And he did survive very long, whether it was because of the buttermilk or irrespective of it, that is difficult to say. But all the same, Mechnikov did end up living a long life. Now, the defense mechanisms, before we go into what is the so-called proper immune mechanisms, let's look at the variety of defense mechanisms that we have. The first is we have a fence all around us in the form of the skin. So the skin itself is protective, but then every fence also has to have a few doors for entry. And we also have at least these three listed here: the mouth, the nose, and the eyes. They are all required, and it is here that the skin is not there. Not only that, through the mouth and the nose, we put in deliberately a lot of material from outside. Through the mouth, food, and through the nose, we let outside air enter us. And all these can be sources of a variety of germs, some of which may not be good for us. And therefore, if the skin is not there, within these regions, we have a, again a sort of a fence which will not let them go much further. So you find that in the mouth, the nose, and the eyes, there are fluids, and these fluids have antibacterial substances, in some cases also antibodies, which are locally active. And therefore, although the fence is not very visible, there is a defense mechanism in all these. And that is why, oral surgery, after oral surgery, we can't have any bandaging, antiseptic bandage, etc. But infections after oral surgery, like say tonsillectomy, are extremely rare. That is because the mouth has inbuilt mechanisms for taking care of the germs locally. And in the same way, the nose also has secretions which are antibacterial in nature. And in fact, one of the first sort of antibacterial substances, penicillin, was discovered accidentally when it was found that the investigator had a common cold, and the nasal secretions dripped into the plate which had bacterial culture, bacteria growing under artificial conditions in the laboratory in a plate. The nasal secretions dripped into it, and he found that around the place where this nasal secretion had dripped, there was a clearing, which means no germs could grow there. And then, a person who has a prepared mind, as Pasteur said, he has a prepared mind. He doesn't feel that, well, something has gone wrong. The bacteria are not growing. But he would think that what is it that it's not making them grow? If it is something from the nose, then can we find uh, something which is similar to what is coming from the nose, which would help in fighting infections? So in the same way, in the eyes, the tears also have a similar mechanism. And in the stomach, we have acid. Most germs can't survive acid. So we have a sort of a fence available even at places where the skin is broken. And as far as the stomach, we have a fence. But then no fence can be completely invincible. There will be always infiltrators who can jump the fence. So then uh, we have to go to the next level. And then we have to have, beyond the fence, some police and army, and that is what the immune system can be looked at. And all the cells that participate in the immune mechanisms are white blood cells. So, when we are told in school, in the primary school, that the blood has two types of cells, red cells and white cells, and the white cells are our soldiers, they defend us against disease. In a sense, this statement is true. And the white blood cells, like the other blood cells, are born in the bone marrow. There are two types of immunity. One is the innate immunity. Innate immunity is something that we are born with. We have these mechanisms right at birth. It is non-specific in nature, which means it doesn't work against just a few selected germs. It works against a variety of germs as well as some other harmful chemicals, which may not be germs. It is non-specific in nature. And it does not require prior exposure, which means that one doesn't have to be exposed to the same germ earlier for it to develop. It is there right at birth. and therefore naturally it does not require a prior exposure to the germ. And it doesn't have any memory, which means that once a person has tackled some germ using the innate immune mechanisms, it's not that the next time the innate immune mechanisms would remember and therefore be able to deal with it more efficiently. Now, these are some of the characteristics of the innate immune system. Uh, and let's see what is the major mechanism that the innate immune system uses. The major mechanism is that of phagocytosis. Phago means to eat, cyto is cell. So it is eating by a cell. And this eating is very similar to the way a single celled organism like an amoeba eats. Uh, Now, here it is sort of shown in a diagrammatic fashion, and the series of steps through which this happens. Suppose there is a germ, and now this germ is to be treated as food by this phagocyte in the innate immune system. They are everywhere, like the guards. You have a guard at every gate in every colony. So it is like, so they are present everywhere. These phagocytes, which are a part of the innate immune system, are all over the body, everywhere. And therefore, uh, this will be the first sort of uh, contact of the germ if it has escaped the fence. If it has escaped the fence, then at the next level, he'll meet these guards, which are everywhere all over the body. And what do these guards do? They have cells which can eat at least a certain variety of germs. And when this phagocyte finds that there's a germ coming along which can be treated as food, what it does, it changes its shape. It throws its arms around this, and the the way it throws the arms looks as if it loves the germ. It's a hug, and in a way, it is true. Why I'm saying that is because I'm reminded of what George Bernard Shaw said in one of his plays: "The tiger loves you. No love is more sincere than the love for food." So for the phagocyte, this germ is food, and no love is more sincere than the love for food. And therefore, it expresses this love by extending the arms as if it is going to hug it. But then it hugs it so tight that now the germ is inside, as you can see in picture number 3. So the germ has been internalized. And then within the phagocyte, this red colored circle is a lysosome. Lysosome has digestive enzymes. Now, the two start moving closer to each other. This bubble that has the germ in it, and this small red bubble which has digestive enzymes in it. And these two bubbles fuse in the phagocyte. And once they have fused, the digestive enzymes are released from this red bubble, and the germ gets digested the way we digest food in our intestinal tract. So this is how the germ is taken care of by the cells of the innate immune system. However, not all germs can be handled this way. There are some which are beyond the capacity of these phagocytes, which are ubiquitous, present all over the body, and the first type of cells that any germ meets, provided it has been able to jump the fence. So innate immunity is present all over the body, and the cells that participate in it are the monocytes. And the other day, when we were talking about blood, we saw that there are two types of blood cells, those which have granules in their cytoplasm and those which don't have. Those which don't have granules are the monocytes and the lymphocytes. And the monocytes are those which do not have granules and have a kidney-shaped nucleus. Now, these monocytes in the blood keep migrating periodically into the tissues, and then their name changes. They're called macrophages. Macro is large, and phage refers to their eating character, large cells that eat. And they act like guards, as we saw that they're acting like the guards, getting hold of the germ. And if they are able to take care of that germ completely, they just kill it by digesting it. So they use a rather primitive method, which may be compared to lynching. But then if they can't lynch, if the germ is too ferocious to be lynched in this fashion, then at least they try to get hold of the germ and pass it on to a less primitive, well-trained force like the police or the army. Less primitive, but primitive all the same, because even the soldiers or the police to whom these guards hand over this culprit is not new. It is present in all animals, including human beings. And therefore, it's not very primitive, but it's less primitive because this mechanism by which the phagocytes eat, this mechanism is present also in single celled animals like amoeba. The amoeba doesn't have any thing beyond this to defend itself. The amoeba also uses something similar to get food as well as to move away from uh, something which may harm it. So, this is a very primitive mechanism, lynching, by which the amoeba eats, these cells also eat. And in the process of eating this germ, they defend us. But if the germ can't be lynched, they hand it over to a less primitive, well trained force. And that force is what we call broadly the specific acquired immunity. So, innate immunity is something which we are born with. Specific acquired immunity, we are not born with, it is acquired after birth. And it is specific in nature, which means that it comes up with a specific response for each different germ. And it requires prior exposure. Once the person has been exposed to it and dealt with a certain infection, then the person is better equipped to deal with it the next time. So the mechanism has a memory. And therefore, it is only after the exposure that the defense mechanism comes into play. And once it has happened, the next time it is much easier because this mechanism has a memory. One might say that if one is not born with specific acquired immunity, one has to acquire it. A newborn baby has still not been exposed to any type of germ. Then how does the newborn defend itself? Uh, in newborn babies, it takes about 1.5 years for specific acquired immunity to develop properly. The apparatus itself takes time. And even after that, it will require exposure to different germs to be able to develop immunity to the large variety of these germs that we have. So that's why one finds that uh, a child quite often keeps having fever. But then before that, you might ask that how does it survive the first 1.5 years before this apparatus has been properly put into place? During that 1.5 years, what helps in the beginning for the first few months at least is the antibodies that were passed on by the mother through her blood to the baby. Secondly, the baby gets a good dose of these antibodies or ready-made sort of, molecules which can tackle infections uh, without the apparatus. With type of apparatus which produces these antibodies, that is not well developed in the baby, but it can acquire this passive immunity by the end products of this immune mechanism, that is the antibodies, by getting them from the mother's blood while it is still in the mother's womb and getting it from the mother's milk after it is born. And that is why one reason, at least, that is one reason, besides many other reasons, why breastfeeding is better than giving any other type of milk. Because through the breast milk, particularly in the first few days, that colostrum, which is a little different from the milk that comes later on, that is a good source of these antibodies and helps the baby develop immunity. So that is how it survives the first 1 to 1.5 years. And that is why uh, if a child has crossed the first year of life, then it is likely to live a full lifespan. So during the first year, in spite of this help that comes from its mother, it remains a little vulnerable. And at the same time, after that, again, it has to be exposed to a variety of germs to be able to acquire immunity to them one by one. And therefore, a child keeps falling sick. There are hardly any child who doesn't get fever a few times in almost every year. But after the child is about 15-year-old, it has been exposed to just about every germ. And these days, for some of them, the child has been vaccinated. And the result is that after the age of about 15, the child rarely falls ill and never needs leave from school or college and keep going throughout the year without any illness. So then illness is more or less a forgotten story. Uh, So that is specific acquired immunity. We are not born with it, we acquire it by getting exposed to the germ, and it is specific for each germ, and it has a memory so that the response to the second infection, that is, the second time a person gets the same infection, is much better than the first time. Now, here we find that there is this phagocyte, and it has been exposed to a germ. Now, this is a type of germ which it can't handle on its own. It will pass it on to the army or the police. It cannot eat it up, but at least it can internalize it. And what we find is that this germ has on its surface a variety of proteins, and some of these proteins are those which are antigenic in nature. Antigen means genuine also means give. Antigen means the protein which will give something which will be against it. So the protein itself has the quality of producing something which will neutralize this protein, which will be against this protein, which will have something which will be related to this protein, and it will be something which this germ will find harmful, something which will make the life of this germ miserable or maybe even kill it. So that is, I drawn it in the form of a spike because during the coronavirus pandemic, it was often said that the coronavirus has an antigen which resides in the spike protein on the surface of the virus. So the spiky red thing is that protein, which is the antigen. And the phagocyte can't kill the germ, but it has internalized it. As you can see, now the germ is inside, and this spike protein, this antigenic protein, is on the surface of this. And now it will hand it over to the less primitive, better trained force, the police or the army. And now, therefore, this phagocyte is given a different name. We call it the antigen presenting cell, APC, because it is presenting the antigen to the better trained force, well trained force, which can now take care of it. And how does it hand it over? It hands it over with the help of some helper cells, which we shall see soon, T helper cells. They help it sort of handhold it and take it to the right place. So for that also it gets help. But then how do these T helper cells come to know that help is required by this antigen presenting cell? It seems that there are some chemicals which it produces, which can be called as a distress call, an SOS message. So the antigen presenting cell sends this distress call, and the T helper cells come along. And how do the T helper cells know which soldier or policeman to hand it over to? Because of the protein on the surface of the antigen presenting cell. Now, what is this? Therefore, we can say that this protein on the surface, this spike in this case, is sort of the ID, the identity card of the germ. So the germ's ID is on the surface, so that using this ID as a guide, the T helper cell can take the antigen presenting cell to the right soldier. So the antigen presenting cell hands over the germ to the police or the border security force or the army, depending upon the situation, which is a well-trained force. Where does it get its training? Now let's see where this force is trained. What are the schools and colleges where it undergoes training? All blood cells, including the white blood cells, are produced in the bone marrow. And all these cells of the immune system are white blood cells. So we start with this germ, the pluripotent cell. Pluripotent because it has plural potency, multiple potency, which means it is still an uncommitted cell. It can form a variety of blood cells, red cells or white cells, and among white cells, any type of cell. So it is still an uncommitted cell. It has a vast potential. Something like, a child who has a potential of many types, and to start with, it goes to a school where a bit of everything is taught, and we try to also find out what is it that the child is really made for, what is it that will this child will be able to do the best. So that is seems to be happening while the pluripotent cell divides. As it divides, it also starts differentiating, so that now these differentiated cells are committed to form either a red cell or a white cell, and among white cells they are committed to form one type of cell or the other. And some of these cells are found to be best suited for forming lymphocytes, it seems, and now those cells are committed to forming lymphocytes, so they've got differentiated into a lymphocyte. And during this period, whatever training it has to get to become a lymphocyte, it is getting here, so it's like homeschooling. But then for further training, it has to go to college. Hmm. So after undergoing homeschooling and schooling in a neighborhood school, now it has to be passed on to a college for further education. Now, some of these go to a neighborhood college, which means the college also is within the bone marrow. And that after that training, these white cells become the B cells, the B lymphocytes. So B, you can say for bone marrow, because they went to a school which was within the bone marrow, a local school, a neighborhood school. So all their education was within the bone marrow, and then they are released to go and function wherever they are required. However, some lymphocytes don't go to the neighborhood college, they go to a distant college. And that distant college is the thymus. Thymus is a small little organ in the neck, uh, hidden by the thyroid gland, but functionally nothing much to do with the thyroid gland. Uh, so this little organ, the thymus, is the college for these lymphocytes. And the thymus is a rather harsh, demanding, exacting college. And it leads to the formation of not just one type of cells like the B cells here, it forms a variety of T cells, T for thymus. It forms a variety of T cells. Not only it produces a variety of T cells, T lymphocytes, which have different functions, it also does one more thing. Some college school students can be very rowdy. So what the thymus does is it eliminates them. Now, what do we mean by a rowdy lymphocyte? These rowdy lymphocytes are those which, if allowed to develop into mature and well-trained uh, lymphocytes, well-trained T cells, they would start acting against some part of the body itself. So they would start acting against some part of the body and start damaging some parts within the body. And when something goes wrong with this mechanism of eliminating these cells, one gets what are called autoimmune diseases. Because that's what happens in autoimmune diseases. We develop antibodies to some part of our own body. And therefore, a healthy immune system really depends upon distinction between what is called self and non-self. Distinguishing cells which belong to the body, belong to us, and distinguishing them from those that do not belong to us, distinguishing self from non-self. So those lymphocytes uh, which would eventually form the type of lymphocytes which may damage some parts of our own body. These are the rowdy college students, and the thymus goes for the radical solution, just kills them. So they are not uh, allowed to study any further. They die within the thymus. But then those which can function, they become super specialists. So a rigorous training to become super specialists. And one may simplify the picture by saying that there are, broadly speaking, three types of T lymphocytes. The T helper cells, which help, as we saw, one of the things they do is to help the antigen presenting cell go to the right soldier. And cytotoxic cells, which produce a variety of cytokines. Uh, and the TK, the killer cells, which can kill. So cytokines are chemicals that are released, killer cells directly kill. We'll talk a little bit more about these a little later, but so this is the way the lymphocytes get educated to form, broadly speaking, two types of cells, B type of lymphocytes and T type of lymphocytes. Now, once they have gone through this education, where do they go and settle? They go and settle in the lymph nodes, in the gastrointestinal tract, the respiratory tract, in the spleen. So once the soldiers are trained, they go and settle in the barracks. So these can be considered sort of the barracks in which they settle. Lymph nodes. Why lymph nodes? Because every organ has near it a set of lymph nodes. The fluid from these organs drains into the lymph nodes, and therefore, if there are germs, they can pass through these channels, which will go to the regional lymph node, that is the lymph node that is near that organ, and can be eliminated there. So they are sort of these sentinels for each organ in the body, each part of the body. And therefore, we find that after an infection, sometimes these lymph nodes may be enlarged and swollen and red. But then that happens because they are doing their job. And like say there's a foot infection, there might be lymph nodes which are in the groin, in the upper part of the thigh, which are swollen and painful for a few days. But then that is because the infection from the leg traveled through the lymphatics, the channels to these lymph nodes, and these lymph nodes are present all over the body and can take care of the infections from different parts. So that is one place where they settle. So for that, the soldiers come out of the barracks and play their role. But then there are some places which are more vulnerable and they have their own local immunity, the gastrointestinal tract and the respiratory tract, because the gastrointestinal tract is exposed to a variety of germs which may enter with the food, and the respiratory tract to the germs which may enter through the air. So there is a local immunity, and these areas also have what is called lymphoid tissue, which means that they have in their walls, the wall of the stomach and intestines, and the wall of the airways, and so on. They have their own lymphoid tissue, which can be called sort of the barracks for the B and T cells. So in this lymphoid tissue, there are B cell areas and T cell areas. And so we can say that in the gastrointestinal tract and the respiratory tract, there is a sort of a border security force, because they are at the border between the outside environment and the inside. So what is going from outside, it is not allowed to get in if it can be harmful. So we have a border security force available right here. How about the spleen? The spleen can be considered a very big lymph node. It has B cell areas, T cell areas, but all the same, you might have heard that in some patients, the spleen is removed for certain reasons. And even after losing the whole spleen, the person seems to function quite normally, which means that if it is there, it must be serving a useful function as a sort of a reserve. But if it is not there, one can still live without it. So this can be considered sort of the Central Reserve Police Force, the CRPF, the body, the spleen. Now let's take the story further. Here is a germ. Uh, it has been seen by the lymphocyte, phagocyte. It can't escape the phagocyte because they are present all over the body. But then the phagocyte realizes it can't take care of it. It has to be handed over to a better trained force, to a well-trained force. And therefore, what it does, it internalizes the germ, puts the ID of the germ on the surface, which will help the T helper cell take it to the right soldier. Now, what is the right soldier? Let's see. Now, here is the antigen presenting cell, which has the antigens of the germ, which are significant for the process, which we may call sort of the IDs of the germ on the surface. And this T helper cell, by looking at this, has brought it to the right place. Now you can see that here, there's a variety of lymphocytes. There's a variety of lymphocytes, and they have on their surface, again, some markers by which one can identify that they are all different, one from the other. And the antigen presenting cell is brought to the right place, and the T helper cell is has brought to the right place. How do you know which is the right place? On the surface, you can see that there is something which is complementary to this. So just to sort of facilitate understanding, the diagrammatic function, this is triangular, and here is a hollow which is also triangular. So this can fit into this. And therefore, this is the soldier which will be useful. But then it is more than a soldier, it is like a factory. This is just giving an indication of the type of arms and ammunition that it can make. And the type of arms and ammunition that will be manufactured in this cell will be specific for this germ. Now, this might look a little different from what you might have imagined. You might have thought that, well, the uh, once the antigen is presenting to these lymphocytes, they will study the germ and then come up with a solution. Now, this is the most amazing part of the immune system. The lymphocytes don't have to do any such thing because it seems that there is a specific lymphocyte for just about every type of antigen that can be presented by the antigen presenting cell, as if they already know in advance what are the types of antigens that are likely to come, and there is a factory, the rudiments of a factory for which can manufacture arms and ammunition for this specific antigen already present in the body. Now, this is amazing how nature anticipated what all germs are likely to attack a human being, have lymphocytes which are specific for each of them, not only for the germs which have existed earlier, but even for new germs which may evolve in future. Coronavirus is a new germ. Still, our body had lymphocytes which could deal with it. And in contrast, what do the scientists do? They take 1 year to study this antigen, then come up with a vaccine. The vaccine works against the germs which have this particular antigen. The virus undergoes a mutation. Now doesn't have this one, it has some other type of antigen. Now you're not sure whether this vaccine will work. Now here you have a situation where the lymphocytes don't have to study what type of an antigen it is. At least a small population of lymphocytes which are specific for this particular antigen already exist in the body. So millions of germs, some which have already evolved, some yet to evolve, and we have a way of dealing with each one of them already installed in the body. An arms and ammunition factory installed in the body for each one of them. This is one of the most amazing things. And once again, nature came to our rescue. A virus like the Omicron, which had a large variety of antigens on its surface, acted like a sort of vaccine because once it went in, then all these a variety of cells were activated because it had a variety of antigens and it made us immune to a very wide variety of forms which the coronavirus might evolve into. So that is how it worked, like a natural vaccine, which was not for just one antigen the way the man-made vaccines were. This was for a variety of antigens because it had a variety of antigens on the surface. So the right place has been selected. So if we call this the ID of the germ, we can say that this thing on the surface of the lymphocyte is the signboard of the factory. The signboard says, this is the type of arms and ammunition I make. So the ID and the signboard on the factory are matched with each other, and the right type of factory is selected. Now, once the right type of factory has been selected, then there's a small population of these. We need much larger number now because we have to deal with the germ which is actually there. These factories are only for a potential infection, which might happen. Now the germ is actually there, so we need much larger number. So it is activated. There are mechanisms for activating this factory, and the activation is, you can say, through multiple division, proliferation, their population increases. So it multiplies its tribe. Now you have a large number of these cells produced by the division of this selected lymphocyte. We may call them the effector cells because they are the ones which will give us an effect which will uh, which will lead to the effect which will help us fight the infection. But along with this, one wise thing that this mechanism does produces also a few memory cells, so that if the infection happens a second time, it is because of the memory cells that we would remember, uh, oh, I have seen this earlier, now I know what to do. And then the response will be much better. That is important because these effector cells will do their job. And after all, soldiers have a limited lifespan. You can't be sure whether they'll come back alive. So they'll do their job. sacrifice their own lives, their population will go down. But the entire experience of having gone through the infection once will help because these memory cells have been left behind so that the second time there's an infection of the same type, exactly the same or closely related to it, then the body knows what to do because it has experienced it earlier. These memory cells do that job. Now, the effector cells uh, may be considered to be of two types. So far, the process was similar for all specific acquired immunity, but the effector cells can be of two types. And depending on that, we say that specific acquired immunity can be of two types, cell-mediated or humoral. Cell-mediated immunity is mediated by sensitized T lymphocytes, which means that now these lymphocytes, T cells, have been sensitized to work against the same type of infection. Broadly speaking, we can say that cell-mediated immunity is required when the germ resides within the cell, whereas humoral immunity is required when the germ is circulating in the blood. So if the germ is within the cell, one of the ways one might think is to deal with it to kill the germ within the cell. But in cell-mediated immunity, that is not what always happens. One of the mechanisms used is by the sensitized killer cells. Killer cell, is one of the types of T lymphocytes. When it is sensitized to a particular antigen, what this killer cell does is to kill the cell in which the germ is residing. So the germ has entered the cell. It has taken shelter in the cell itself, feeling that it will be safe there. But cell-mediated immunity takes care of it by killing the cell. It's a rather radical cure, like, if the person has the headache, beheading the person. But all the same, in this situation, it is uh, the best thing to do. Better to get rid of a few cells which have these germs than to let the germ proliferate and affect more and more cells, enter more and more cells of the body. The second type of mechanism that cell-mediated immunity uses is to produce cytokines. Now, cytokines are chemicals which again help in fighting this infection, which is because of germs which have entered the cell, and viruses do enter the cell, and therefore, in case of infections like coronavirus, it helps because the viruses enter the cells because by themselves they do not have a whole mechanism for survival. They use our DNA or RNA to our protein manufacturing machinery in the cell to survive. So, therefore, they are within the cell. And one of the ways you might have heard they were being dealt with was through producing cytokines. That's why, sometimes when this something went wrong with this mechanism, the wisdom gone awry, there was a cytokine storm. Now, what do these cytokines do when they are working properly? What these cytokines do is to attract other white cells of the blood, which can take care of the infection. They help in multiplying their own tribe so that we have more sensitized T cells of the same type available to take care of the situation. They reduce the multiplication of the germ within the cells and they increase the resistance of the person's cells to this germ so that these germs will not be able to enter more cells because now these other surviving cells into which the germs have not yet entered are more resistant to the entry of the cell. So these are some of the things that these cytokines can do. So there are two types of mechanisms that cell-mediated immunity uses, predominantly for infections by germs which enter the cells. One is killing the cell into which the germ has entered. That is what the killer type of T cells do. And the second mechanism is to produce cytokines that produce chemicals which will act at multiple levels, attract more white cells, multiply their own tribe, increase the resistance of the host, reduce the multiplication of the germ. In other words, all these chemicals put together make the life of the germ miserable, make it miserable, and therefore it can be eliminated. So this is how cell-mediated immunity works. The humoral immunity works by production of antibodies. And this is what we shall concentrate more on in the next few minutes. So humoral immunity expressed by B cells by production of antibodies. In fact, B cells get transformed into uh, plasma cells. Uh, The detail is not absolutely relevant, but at the same time, no harm knowing it, that these B cells undergo a little transformation into plasma cells, and it is the plasma cells that manufacture the antibodies. Now, how does an antibody work? Now, this diagram is extremely diagrammatic. All the diagrams so far were diagrammatic, but in this one, it is all imagination just to facilitate understanding. Now, this Y-shaped structure is the antibody. This has a rough resemblance to the type of structure that these antibody molecules actually have. And you can see that this antibody has three places which can bind something. One is which can bind to the protein which has given rise to this antibody. So once again, that same spike and this antibody has the corresponding hollow. So it is like a lock and key arrangement. The lock came with the food, and the right factory which could manufacture the keys for that lock was selected from the lymphocytes, and it has given rise to these antibodies, which are its arms and ammunition, which can work as keys for this particular lock. But then it has two other binding sites. One is for the complement. Complement, is a series of, actually, it's not a single protein. It's the result of a series of, or a chain of chemical reactions involving a large number of proteins collectively, which may be called the complement. But the second site is for the complement. So because you can see it completes complement, because it completes the action of the antibody. Without the complement, this part alone will not be enough. This specific key will not be enough by itself unless the complement which can complete its function will be there. And then, it has to be taken close to a cell which can eat the germ, and that is the phagocyte. So the third site is for binding to the phagocyte. So the simile here is that we may compare the antibody to a dining table. And here is the chair at which the diner can sit. So this third binding site, which is for the phagocyte, may be considered a chair. The diner is there. It's a fussy guest. It wants not only the food, but also some sauce to go with it. Unless it becomes palatable, it will not eat it. So now the antibody has arranged for the food. It has arranged for the sauce, and it is presented to the diner. And now it can eat the germ. So this is one way in which the antibodies work against germs. If there is a chemical, then of course, so much complication is not needed. The antibody itself can neutralize the chemical. But by and large, this is the way antibodies work. With the help of the complement, it is the phagocyte which so the primitive phagocytic mechanism, which was there even in the amoeba we saw, continues to play a role even in this relatively advanced, newly evolved form of immunity, that is the humoral immunity. So this is how antibodies work. They hand over the germ to the phagocyte. But then don't forget the memory cell, because all this response is very good. It helps us fight the infection with no symptoms or minimal symptoms. So say point one, this one indicates the first exposure to the infection. Within about 3 weeks, the antibody levels have reached their peak. The infection has been taken care of. The person actually experienced symptoms or did not experience symptoms at all. But now the infection has been tackled. By now, if it's a flu-like virus, then within a week, the person is all right. But the response is continuing maybe for a few days even after that. But then the antibody levels start coming down. And if the person is exposed a second time, you find that the response is much faster and much better. So it's both quick and steep. And therefore, the person is unlikely to experience any symptoms. The first time the person might have experienced symptoms, the second time unlikely to experience symptoms because of this extremely brisk and sharp and steep response. Now, this is something important to understand, which was being ignored when the media were talking everything about antibodies. We found people who were positive, but they didn't have antibodies. We found people who had an infection, but when they didn't have antibodies. We found people who had been vaccinated, but a few months later they didn't have antibodies, and therefore they had to be given, they should be given a booster, and so on and so forth and so on. Now, just imagine if the antibodies were to remain at a high level for every infection, even after the infection has been tackled, the thousands of germs against which our body produces antibodies, the blood will be full of antibodies. It is therefore desirable that these antibody levels go down, and there are memory cells which will come into play if and when we get infected a second time. You don't have to be in a state of readiness all the time for all the germs. The soldiers don't have to be in fighting action all the time. You have to, they have to go back to the barracks. The arms and ammunition has to be dumped somewhere. So if these antibodies are the arms and ammunition, it is being dumped somewhere. That's why the levels are going down. But we are ready when the second comes a second time. So when you find that even amongst those who are found positive, and of course, everybody cannot be tested, no matter how much testing you do in a pandemic like the coronavirus pandemic, everybody can't be tested. But even amongst those you test, you'll find a variety of people. Some people are positive, but they have no antibodies. They have no antibodies because they were extremely healthy, perhaps, and they did not, their germ did not cross the respiratory tract. They were dealt with by the border security force. So if their nose and airways could take care of the germ, it never ended up activating the specific immune system which will give rise to antibodies. It was taken care of locally. Some of them got mild symptoms like running nose. Some did not get even that, and remained blissfully unaware of the fact that they got an infection unless they got tested and tested positive. These were probably the largest number. And that's how we survived. And of course, there were many who got sick, many who died, but all the same, look at the percentage who survived. That happened because this was happening. But then in some cases, the virus did get past the airways and the person did fall sick, produced antibodies, or produced antibodies, but the antibody levels went down. So the person was prone to a second infection, but the second infection was much milder, or the second time the person didn't even come to know that I got infected. Now, this also is a proper time to discuss the principle of vaccination. The principle of vaccination, broadly speaking, is that you do not have to wait for the person to get the infection the first time to evoke this response. In the case of germs, it is possible to separate the antigenic component of the germ from the pathogenic component. Antigenic, which gives rise to antibody response, and pathogenic, which gives rise to disease. So in some way, if you're able to separate the two so that you let the antigenic component enter the body, but not the pathogenic component, then the person will acquire the immunity, that is, develop antibodies, but not the disease. So you're basically separating these two aspects of the germ. One, its capacity to give rise to antibody response, and the second is its capacity to produce disease. So you can separate the two, split the two. You give the component as a vaccine, the component which can give rise to the antibody response, then the person does not fall sick because you have in some way neutralized the pathogenic component. So the pathogenic component is not active in the vaccine, and the result is that the person has produced these antibodies. And therefore, when the person actually gets that infection, although for the person it is the first time that the person is actually getting an infection, the body treats it as if the infection is coming for the second time. The vaccine itself acted as the first exposure to the germ. The real infection, even when it is the first infection, is treated by the body as the second infection, and therefore the response is more brisk. So that is how the vaccine works. Vaccines in general work. Now, how do we split the antigenic from the pathogenic component? There are a variety of methods that have been used. One of them is the killed vaccine. If you kill the germ cannot produce disease because it has been killed, but you kill in such a way that the antigenic component is not damaged, it doesn't disintegrate, and this will work as a vaccine. The second type of vaccine is the attenuated vaccine. That is the vaccine in which the germ has been attenuated. Attenuated means made mild, so that it has been made so mild that it will not produce the disease, but it will still be useful so far as antigenic component is concerned. So antigenic component is intact, but the capacity to cause disease has been made extremely mild so that it is unlikely to produce any disease. So attenuated. It has been tempered down. Now, again, this behind this, how this principle was discovered, there's a little story. Uh, there was a group of scientists working on the chicken cholera germ, and therefore they were to study it. They were growing it in culture plates, which means under artificial conditions, you have a plate in which you provide all the nourishment that these germs may need, and let them grow so that you have them available in large numbers, and then you can try those things which may be able to uh, reduce their multiplication or kill these germs. Now, to use these culture plates, uh, you pick up the germ from the culture plate and put it, sort of introduce into the, say, chicken. The chicken gets cholera. So that is how one can study these germs. These germs, chicken cholera germs, had the capacity to produce cholera in chickens. Now, once uh, leaving behind some such culture plates, the staff went away on a vacation. And when they came back after the vacation, they found that when they were transferring the germs from these culture plates to the chickens did not get cholera. And on the other hand, if they produced a fresh culture, that did produce cholera in the chickens. So, what is the difference between the two? The difference was that in the culture plate, which had been left behind during the vacation, the germs had undergone repeated multiplication. And the new generation of germs that had been produced through this repeated multiplication had lost the capacity to cause disease. And at the same time, the antigenic component had been retained, but they had lost the capacity to produce disease. You may sort of think of it like this, that if there's a wild animal which hunts in the forest and is dependent on that food, if you put that animal in a zoo, the animal doesn't have to hunt anymore. You provide it ready-made food in a plate every day, the way lions and tigers are fed in a zoo. This lion or tiger forgets how to hunt. So in a way, it loses its capacity to hunt. It is attenuated. Or say even in human beings, if somebody has the luxury of getting everything without doing any work, the person forgets to work. So these germs, for them to produce disease, is like hunting, like doing some hard work to be able to survive. In the culture plate, all the nourishment was available. And when that was available generation after generation, eventually a generation came which forgot how to do that work. So it was no longer able to produce the disease, although it was still alive. So this was how the principle of attenuated vaccines was discovered. So once in a while, it's nice to go on a vacation. It may lead to a discovery. Yeah? Then the related germ vaccines. A germ against which a response is evoked, sometimes that same response in the body works also against a related germ. And the classical example here is that of cowpox. Cowpox affects only cows, but if we introduce this cowpox germ, it will not cause disease in the human beings, but it will give rise to a response which will work against smallpox. So a related germ vaccine. Then toxoid. Toxoid, is a modified toxin. Toxin is a chemical produced by the germ which produces the disease. It can be modified so that it will no longer be toxic, but it still retains the capacity to evoke an immune response. And the classical example here is that of tetanus toxoid. And some of you would have received a tetanus toxoid injection after an injury, because injury from a dirty surface can lead to tetanus, which is a very dreaded disease. It can lead to death. And therefore, as a routine, after any injury in which the surface might be dirty, toxoid vaccine injection is given. And since one doesn't know when one might get an injury, uh, but luckily the toxoid injection works for about 5 years. In fact, it's recommended as a routine. A person should keep getting a tetanus toxoid injection once in 5 years. Most people don't do it, neglect it. I also neglect it, but all the same, that is sort of the ideal teaching that this is something which we should keep taking throughout life every 5 years. Just one tetanus toxoid. One doesn't know when one will get an injury and whether one will be able to get a place where you can get tetanus toxoid within a reasonable time. Not only that, if the person has been given this every 5 years, because of the memory that will be retained in the body, the response will be very good even before the person gets the toxoid injection. Then the purified antigen vaccine. Why not just isolate that component of the germ which gives rise to the antibody response and give that? That would cause minimum complications because whatever side effects may be there because of the other components of the vaccine will not be there because it's a purified antigen. These are the vaccines of the future. But all the same, the vaccines have been around for a relatively short period of time. We have survived for millions of years without these vaccines, and animals continue to do. Even now, nobody goes and vaccinates animals by and large, unless it's a pet animal. By and large, animals don't get vaccinated, and still they continue, they survive. Uh, so, what has helped us is our own immune system, and in the absence of the system, no amount of antibiotics and no amount of vaccines can help us. The person has a premature death if the person has immunodeficiency. So, therefore, the immune system may be called our silent super personal protection equipment. We have it inbuilt in us, installed in each one of us. It works silently, like all the uh, really important work is done silently. Even the creation of this universe by the divine was not announced on the internet. There was no band announcing it. It was without any noise. Silently, it happened. And the new creation, which Shaurobindo and the mother have talked about, which will have a significantly higher level of consciousness, for that also the beginning has been made, but then we don't seem to acknowledge it because that also happened silently. So all great things happen quite silently, and that is how this immune system also works. So much so that we sometimes even forget it. We forget it because it works silently, and all the same, this is what has made us survive, coexist with the germs, which may cause us disease and death. In spite of that, we have been able to survive. Animals have been able to survive for millions of years because of this inbuilt super personal protection equipment. However, our immune system is not a fixed entity. It is subject to modulation. And this is again something which doctors also often forget because of the great detail that is known about the immune system. As I said, that I know very little, and what a top immunologist would know is much more, and what the world knows is still greater, and what remains to be known is also even more than that. So, but even what is known is enough to give us a great deal of complex details about the immune system. And when you learn about something in such detail, one assumes as if the germ enters, then this is what happens, then this is what happens, then this is what happens. There's an antigen presenting cell, and there is a selection of the right type of lymphocyte, and then there is a cell mediated immunity, there's a acquired immunity. So when you understand the details of all this, and the details are mind boggling now, uh, the person starts feeling as if this is an automatic mechanism which will happen in exactly the same way in each one of us once a germ enters the body. But that is not how it happens. It is subject to modulation. It can work to different with different degrees of efficiency in different people, and this efficiency can be modified. Now, what is it that strengthens immunity? The right type of diet, taking the right type of food in the right amount in the right way. And when we talk about the diet, don't forget the spices. Spices are a concentrated source of antioxidants, and antioxidants are, uh, in general, immunoboosting, immunoenhancing. And that is what happened during the coronavirus. Suddenly, everybody became conscious of the positive effects of spices like the black pepper, kali mirch, haldi, turmeric, ginger, adrak, long pepper, People, we suddenly became conscious of all these and realized their therapeutic effects. But then, what was being used as a preventive and as treatment through these spices is also a part of our culinary practices. We use it routinely in the food, and that is what gives us a good immunity. And that might have been one of the factors, this being a part of our routine culinary practices, might have been one of the factors why our immunity levels were perhaps good. And therefore, India did not suffer as much from the pandemic as some of the Western countries did. So, a good, healthy diet, including a moderate amount of spices of the right type, is what gives us good immunity. Then regular, moderate physical activity. The yogic activity is better than others. We'll not go into the reasons why and the details of this. Then not putting into the body harmful substances like tobacco and alcohol, which can reduce the immunity, impair the immunity, and getting good quality sleep. Voluntary chronic sleep deprivation is emerging as a major cause of illness, and it also manifests as low immunity. So one not only gets lifestyle diseases like hypertension and heart disease because of inadequate sleep, infections also become more frequent. You might have seen that if a person does not get the right amount of sleep for a few days or weeks at a stretch, the person is likely to come down with a common cold, which forces him to take a good nap to make up for that lost sleep. So adequate, good quality sleep is also important. There is one more factor which is extremely important, perhaps which can override all these, and that's why I put it in the next slide, and that is peace of mind, faith, and hope. This can override many of the physical factors. So, to be at peace, to have faith in the healing mechanisms of the body, and therefore to have hope that I will get well, all this contributes to better immunity. Correspondingly, immunity is weakened by fear, depression, and lack of hope, the opposites of these. And when immunity is deranged, it doesn't only lead to infection, it can lead to other things also. Immunodeficiency can lead to infections, it can also lead to cancer. It can lead to infections that is easy to understand because the germs can't be handled properly, leads to cancer because cancer cells also treated by the body as not belonging to the self. They're not like the normal body cells. They are also eliminated by the immune system. And therefore, the very beginning of a tumor is generally something that we never come to know about. Probably small little tumors are forming in each one of us from time to time, but the immune cells take care of them. So, in relation to cancer, particularly, we call it immunological surveillance. So, the surveillance system, uh, which is built into the immune system, helps us in preventing cancers, cancers which do not manifest, we don't come to know about them. So, immunodeficiency is one thing which is the result of deranged or impaired or abnormal immunity. Second thing is that it can work over time for the wrong reasons. That is hypersensitivity. Instead of being sensitive to germs, it becomes sensitive to the pollen grains, which are unavoidable in the environment, or it becomes sensitive to a food, and so on. So these allergies. And why food allergies are becoming more common and are more common in the West than in India, one of the hypotheses is that the West has developed a lifestyle which is extremely sanitized. And therefore, the immune system does not get an opportunity to work. We try to prevent all types of infections using by going into excess of hygiene and also coming using a very large number of vaccines so that the person does not get a chance to develop the immune system. Then the immune system starts working overtime uh, for the wrong reasons, and that may be one reason why allergies then become more common in such situations. Then autoimmunity. When something goes wrong with the immune system, it may start working against some part of the body itself. There may be antibodies against the pancreas, which may give rise to diabetes. There may be antibodies against the thyroid, which leads to impaired thyroid function. And there can be many other types of autoimmune diseases. This person, Norman Cousins, got an autoimmune disease, ankylosing spondylitis, uh, in the 1960s. And being an intelligent, educated person, he started uh, thinking about his disease because he was told that only 1 in 500 survive ankylosing spondylitis, and we don't have anything very specific to offer. That's what he was told by the doctors. Uh, and then he somehow connected it with the stress that he had gone through in the days and weeks before he came down with ankylosing spondylitis. So then he thought if then he asked a question which doctors had forgotten to ask. They had forgotten to ask because of the advances that modern medicine experienced during the last during say the period of about 1900 to 1950. That was a period, of spectacular developments in modern medicine. All the vaccines, antibiotics, and treatment of endocrine diseases like thyroid and pancreas, and treatment of nutritional deficiencies because of the discovery of vitamins. All that happened during that short period, with the result that life expectancy jumped steeply from about 30 to 40 years to about 70 years. So doctors had forgotten to ask this simple question, which he asked. So sometimes not knowing enough can be useful. So he asked that if stress could be in some way related to this disease that I have got, ankylosing spondylitis, will not happiness and relaxation help? And to cut a long story short, he started treating himself with laughter and vitamin C. And using just these two things, laughter and vitamin C, he became one out of those 500 who recovered from the disease. And then he went on to write this book, Anatomy of an Illness. And this attracted the attention of many medical scientists. And in countries, where the rules are not very rigid, although he was not a doctor or a medical scientist, he was invited by the University of California at Los Angeles Medical School to join on their faculty. And in that position, what he did was one was to increase the awareness of the mind body relationship among the doctors in that and the medical students in that medical school. Another thing that he did was start giving ideas for research projects, started writing research grants, and soon UCLA School of Medicine had more funds that it could use for studying the mind body relationship. And when that happened, then it started offering funds to others. So, in a way, UCLA became a funding agency for the rest of the United States for supporting research on the mind body relationship. So, there was a great acceleration of this research sometime in the 1970s and 80s and went on for at least 20, 25 years. And the result was by the year of around 2000, a whole new branch of science had developed, which we now call psychoneuroimmunology. Psycho, the mind, working through the nervous system to affect the immune system. So the mental peace strengthens immunity, and things like fear, anxiety, depression, and sorrow, they depress the immune system. That relationship was studied in this, and that in a way also became a sort of a bridge between the subjective and the objective. Psychological states are subjective, but the effects observed in the form of antibody levels and the killer cell population and so on, those are objective in nature. They give us numerical data which can be analyzed, which convinces scientists that something is really important, significant is going on. And that's how that was the importance of this discipline. So he's considered now the father of psychoneuroimmunology, and he survived this illness, which only 1 in 500 generally did, and also ended up helping the rest of the world once again recognize the mind body relation. Once again, because it was a rediscovery. Ancient systems of medicine like Ayurveda knew it. The pioneers in modern medicine like Hippocrates also knew it. But then, as I said, it was forgotten in the early 20th century because of the getting overshadowed, getting eclipsed by the advances in the physical aspects of medicine. But then this rediscovery came in the second half of the 20th century. Spiritual masters never forgot it, although doctors did. And here's a quote from the mother: establish a greater peace and quietness in your body that will give you the strength to resist attacks of illness. We can look at it like this, that the agent or the germ is an essential component in the disease process. But while it is essential and necessary to produce a specific disease, it is not sufficient. It also depends upon how much resistance the host offers to the disease. how well equipped we are with our inbuilt mechanisms for resisting illness, for staying healthy. Not only that, the environment also matters. That is the surroundings in which we live. We may compare the agent or the germ to a seed. The seed will not grow unless the soil is good. So the host is the soil, but then the environment is also important. The uh, After putting it in the right type of soil, we should also have the right temperature and the right amount of rainfall at the right time, without which again the seed will not grow. So in the same way, the germ also uh, can give rise to a disease only if the host doesn't have poor resistance, and the environment is also conducive to the growth of the germ. Uh, so all these three interact to give rise to the disease. So it's not just the seed which is important, the soil and the surroundings are also important. Now let's see how it can be applied to the COVID-19, which is still fresh in our memory. Here the agent was the coronavirus, the host was the human being. And human beings had varying degrees of resistance. And one of the things that could influence our resistance is our mental state. And this is a very uh, telling sort of a the computer battery, I think, needed a recharge. So switched it on. So if we get a warning, like the way the germs give us a warning, the screen became a little less bright. Then knew why. So COVID-19, here's a report which appeared on the 24th of April 2021 from Hyderabad. The pandemic has had a devastating effect on people tested positive to the extent that many are collapsing and dying of fear. So people are so afraid that if I'm corona positive, that itself is enough to kill me. Well, what it means is that I have germs picked up from my respiratory tract, which you saw could be tackled so well in the respiratory tract itself if it crosses that border security force by the antibody producing mechanisms. So chances are most of these people would have got no disease at all or emerged with only mild symptoms, overcome it with only mild symptoms. And instead, what happened was because of the fear, they died. Now, what are the agent is coronavirus, host is the human beings whose immunity uh, depended a lot on the psychological state. How about the environment? Pollution. Again, it was pointed out that places which have a high level of environmental pollution are likely to have suffer from the pandemic more. But is the pollution only because of the chemicals in the environment? Is it only because of the uh, particles in the environment? Here is something which comes from a psychiatrist, Dr. Alok Pandey. Powerful collective suggestions emanating from our current notions that seep in subconsciously. When to this collective atmosphere we find added the pronouncement of doom from a grave faced, scientifically trained doctor, then its power to damage and diminish the healing capacity becomes enormous. Now, during the coronavirus pandemic, these collective suggestions emanating from our notions were seeping in as a result of the media bliss, giving us all the figures of people who got corona, who were dying, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the collective atmosphere was such that it led to fear and depression. The anxiety, I might get it. My near and dear ones might get it. If a person is positive, I might die, and so on and so forth. And this fear was being accentuated further very often by the scientifically trained doctors supporting this fear and quite often saying as if the only way out was to take a vaccine. And all this put together, the atmosphere that was built up of fear and anxiety and panic, it has an enormous effect on diminishing the healing capacity to fight disease, capacity to heal because of the depressed immune system. Dr. Alok Pandey has written a beautiful book on the subject, Veda of the Body, where he points out these three important things which are important for withstanding disease, resisting illness, faith. faith in the capacity of the body to heal, self in our own self-healing mechanisms, of which the immune system is an important part. And we know how to strengthen that. And then we strengthen it and same time have faith in it. Receptivity to higher force. Because after all, who has created this immune system? This amazing immune system that we talked about, where there is a small population of uh, soldiers or ammunition factories already present for every germ that the world has seen in the past and the germs which may evolve in future. Who has put this together? That higher force. Do we let that higher force work in an uninhibited manner in the body? The fear, anxiety, and lack of faith does not even let that higher force work properly in the body. So, if we take away all those doubts and fears and suspicions and mistrust in this higher force and in the healing capacity of the body, which is a reflection of that higher force, we'll improve our receptivity to that higher force, which will become more open to that higher force. That higher force will get a better opportunity to work in our body. We have to let it work. That is what is meant by a better receptivity. And another closely related thing is the will. The will to live and the wish to die both are very potent forces. So, having the will to live, the will to recover, along with the faith and improvement in the receptivity is the best combination for staying healthy as well as recovering from disease quickly and completely. This is from a cardiologist. Not diet, not drugs, not exercise, not smoking, not surgery, not even genetics. No other factor has a more powerful effect on health and premature death and disease than love and intimacy. So, the important thing is love and intimacy. Intimacy, which develops from a sense of oneness, which inspires love, which in turn strengthens our immune system. So, once again, we are back to that. Being good makes us more loving and caring. Being more loving and caring makes us happy. Because love is expressed by giving, and there's a joy of giving, mental peace that comes from giving, and that in turn leads to better health and healing. Uh, I did recently a series of 5 talks, which are on our YouTube channel, on the pioneers in mind body medicine, which includes Norman Cousins, whom we talked about, who overcame his ankylosing spondylitis with a combination of love and with a combination of laughter and vitamin C. And this cardiologist, Dean Ornish, who is one of the pioneers in using yoga in its most comprehensive sense for the treatment of heart disease. Apart from these two, also 3 other pioneers, Herbert Benson, Bernie Siegel, and Larry Dossey. And you'll find these 5 relatively short sessions also on the YouTube. And they'll tell you what they contributed, how they contributed, and what is it in their personal life that made them turn to this area of investigation and exploration. And out of these 5, 4 are highly qualified doctors who went to some of the best medical schools in the world and were trained in modern scientific medicine and yet turned to this area and became the pioneers in establishing the mind body relationship, which of course remains inadequate without the soul mind body continuum. And here's the last word from Sri Aurobindo: to feel love and oneness is to live. So, to live a meaningful life, we should have a sense of oneness. This oneness will inspire love, and that in turn will be expressed by giving what we have to those who need it, which in turn will give us peace and joy, which in turn will lead to good health. So, that is the chain. Health becomes a byproduct. Fulfillment of the purpose of life also is a byproduct. Some suggested reading: the same book, The Human Machine, which I've shown you a number of times. This topic is in chapter 9, the body defenses. This is a popular book for the general public. And these are 2 textbooks: Fundamentals of Physiology, about 400 pages, Medical Physiology, about 1,000 pages. This is a beautiful picture of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch, where I stay and work, and you're all welcome here. For any questions or comments, You may ask after the session or drop an email to yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
Thank you, Dr. Bijlani, for explaining it so beautifully. I don't remember last when somebody had explained our human body so beautifully put. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any questions? Aditi, any questions in the chat?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I had a question. You spoke about autoimmune condition. So autoimmune conditions are affect different parts of the body's organs. So do all the rowdy cell that you called, are they all produced at the thymus, or that attack different parts of the body or the different organs within the body?
Yes, one way of looking at autoimmune diseases would be that they are the result of cells which have escaped the uh, mechanisms present in the thymus, which prevent these cells from getting into the circulation. So either the thymus is weak or the thymus has been overwhelmed because of derangement in immunity, which may be because of various factors, particularly mental stress, and of course other physical lifestyle factors also make a contribution. But the psychological factors seem to be the most important. And that may be one reason why the deficiency of thyroid is becoming extremely common. And for some strange reason, which may be genetic in nature, it's much more common in women than in men. So every other woman you talk to these days seems to have a thyroid deficiency. And that may be because of this collective sort of a effect of poor lifestyle in terms of physical factors as well as stress levels.
Thank you.